healthy, poor, busy, lazy. No matter where you are, no matter where you live, so as long as you are alive, you have this blessing. As Charles pointed out this morning, just a few moments ago, time is the only thing that we share exactly alike. And that is, time is something we all possess as a blessing. You may not realize it, but I want to share with you something this morning. Time is something that we cannot beg for. Time is something we cannot borrow from someone else. Time is not something you can steal from someone else. But as I've said before, I'll say it one more time, time is something that we all share alike. We all possess this blessing. However, the truth is, time is a blessing we all temporarily possess. So what are some of the things that you do with your time? That's the first question that I want to ask, because the truth is, one can either choose to use their time foolishly, or one can use their time wisely. So will you choose to use your time wisely, or will you choose to use your time foolishly? One could use your time efficiently in life, or you could simply choose to run out the clock and watch the time fade away of your life. One could spend their time seeking to live out God's will, or they could simply determine to live their lives foolishly. In fact, you might say that one could simply choose to waste that blessing of time. Now, I have a question for you. How many of you remember the name David Cassidy? Raise your hand if you remember the name David Cassidy. Yeah, I heard that. A lot of you ladies thought David Cassidy back in the day was a heartthrob, and all these young ladies in the room are going, "Who's that?" David Cassidy of the famed show, The Partridge Family, made a name for himself as a rock star. He wanted to be a rock star in real life, but instead he played one on TV. Now, in a lot of people's minds, David Cassidy lived a good life. He lived a life that many people in our world, and even some in our churches, would say, "I'd love to live out that dream." But let me tell you something about David Cassidy that you may not know. He passed away back on November the 21st, 2017. He was 67 years old. The day of his passing, he called in his daughter, Katie. And she kneeled down at his bedside, knowing that his time was very, very short. And as Katie leaned over, as her father breathed some of his last breaths, he shared with her his final words. And it is, to me, some of the most tragic words anyone could ever say in this life. Folks, that man, as much glory as he received in his life, as much fame as he had in his life, his final words were, "So much wasted time." When I read that quote, a blanket of sadness engulfed my heart. Folks, I would hope that my last words, I would hope that your last words are nowhere even close to that phrase, so much wasted time. It is a sad commentary on one's life that by the end of your life you look back and realize all the time that you've wasted in this life. And the truth is, there may be someone in this room this morning that has come to realize that they have been wasting a lot of the time that God has blessed them with in this life. First of all, if you've recognized that, God bless you, because you are a step ahead of a lot of other people. So this morning, I want us to consider our passage in James. James was the brother of Jesus who became a pillar of the early church. In the 4th chapter of this book, as we continue our study of faith works, James is seeking to get us as his readers to consider, where are we right now in our relationship with Jesus Christ? And now James is going to offer us some ways that you and I can ascertain, is Jesus really right now the Lord of my life? Is His Lordship really the determining factor of my life? So the passage that we're going to look together this morning, James is talking about, quite simply, how do you choose to live your life? In fact, the key passage on this section, in fact, the entire sermon is built around verse 14, in which James says these words. Listen very carefully. Look back in your Bible at verse 14, when James says, "For you are like vapor that appears for a little while, then vanishes." This comment of James goes to the thought that the time that we have here on this earth is short. Yes, it may be short, but no matter how short it may be, it is still a blessing. But like any blessing that God has given us, I challenge us to consider that we all have to determine what we will do with this blessing. What will we do with the time that we possess right here and right now? Because ultimately we have to make that determination. Let's start now with verse 13. James 4 and verse 13 starts out with two words, "Come now. You who say today or tomorrow we will travel to such and such a city and spend a year there and do business and make profit." With that verse in mind, let me ask you a question this morning. It's going to be up on the screen now. It's a question that I believe all of us must answer before we leave this morning, before we continue with our life. And that is quite simply, where does God fit in your timeline? Where does God fit in your life? It's one thing to claim to your friends and your family, to your neighbors, to your coworkers, that you belong to Jesus, that you are a Christian. It's one thing to make that claim, but it's a whole nother to really and truly live that out in real life. James offers us a real life scenario this morning. A real life scenario when he speaks of a business person who has made some plans for his immediate future. Now, I mentioned that phrase, "come now," because it's used here in this verse. It's also used in James chapter 5 and verse 1. Now, when you read that phrase, "come now," that is a vigorous form of address that serves to draw attention. Now, before I dig into this text a little bit further, I want to mention something right here that I think oftentimes when you study this section of James, people get a little bit sidetracked. And here's why. I want to say this very clearly this morning. This section of James is not a condemnation of, number one, doing business. It's not telling us that it's wrong to conduct business, nor is it wrong to seek to make a profit in life. That's not the case. It's not even condemning the concept of desiring to do well financially. But this passage is all about, and think about it, where does God fit into your plans? In this message this morning, I want to equate two things together. And let's look at it on the screen. These two things, you can't have one without the other. I'm not talking about love and marriage. I'm talking about time. I'm talking about life. Because when it comes to life and time, I equate one with the other, because you can't have one without the other. You see, in the day that James was writing these words, the Jewish merchants of that day were known to travel great distances in order to conduct business. Now, as much as the Jews may have had some ill feelings towards the Romans for their circumstances, one thing they appreciated about the Romans were the fact that the Romans built a lot of nice roads. In fact, you would have to know, if you studied history, that the road system in the Roman Empire provided these Jewish merchants the freedom to conduct business in a way that they had never had before. So back to the question, the first point, where does God fit in your timeline? James offers up, again, this real-life scenario of a business situation where a person in question is using their time. Again, no problem with using your time to conduct business, but the problem is he did so without regard, you might write this down, for God's will. You see, it's one thing to conduct business. It's one thing to want to make gain financially, have a profit, do well, provide for your family. All of that is fine and good in the eyes of God. But the moment where you do so and take out of the equation regard for God's will, that's when you run into the problems. Now, grammatically, the structure of this verse, it suggests that this person is someone who would do this habitually. This is not just a person who woke up one day and had a slip of the mind and forgot to include God in his plans. We're talking about somebody, like many of us from time to time in our life, who make plans and never think about God's regard for our plans. What you see here in our text this morning is someone who has consciously decided, I'm going to do what I want, when I want, whatever I want, and I don't care what God has to say about it. Now, I don't think this man would have come out and made such a bold statement, but when you make plans in your life without regard for God's will, that's what you are, in fact, saying to God. Now, notice the verse speaks of when the person will travel, right? Speaks of where the person will travel, right? Speaks of how long the person will travel and why they will travel. Now, when you see those things, what that shows me is that this guy has firm plans and he's got a lot of confidence and expectation about what he is doing in his plans. Folks, let me tell you, and think about this. Is it not easy for us in our life to get so busy and get so involved in plan making for our life that some days we go without even giving a thought to where does God fit into my day? How many of us last week, let's just take last week for an example, how many of you made a conscious decision every day to ask the question, God, what is it you have in your plan for my day? Or did you simply just approach the day with, well, I've got all these plans, I've got to get this done, I've got to get that done, and God, if you want to be involved, I've got a few leftovers for you. Jesus told the story about a very successful farmer who had an abundant harvest, but in the process ignored God in his life. Look in your Bibles, Luke chapter 12, verses 18 through 20. Again, Luke chapter 12, 18 through 20. Now listen to what this farmer says, and then listen to how the story is carried out. The farmer says in verse 18, I will do this. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones and store all my grain and my goods in that bigger barn. And then I'll say to myself, you have many goods stored up for many years. So take it easy. Drink and enjoy yourself. But I want you to listen very carefully to what God had to say. You see, what God had to say was, you are a fool. This very night, your life is demanded of you. And the things that you have prepared, whose will they be? Now, I've read that many times in my life, and this particular parable, a lot of people say, Jonathan, that seems like our God was kind of mean in this story. That our God was kind of mean to the farmer, but I want you to realize the point. And the point is, it was the farmer who ignored the one who helped make him successful. It is a slap in the face of God for you to be prosperous and successful and forget who got you where you're at today. So where does God fit? Will you decide to spend the blessing of your time in this life with no room for God and His plans for your life? All right, the next verse shows us why this is not a wise way to conduct your life. Look at verse 14. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. You do not know what your life will be, for you're like a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes. With that in mind, the next question in our lesson this morning is quite simple. What are you? I'm speaking to everybody in this room, including myself. It is for all of us. If you are the eldest person in this room to the very youngest of conscionable mind, I'm going to ask you to think about this question with me. What are you seeking with the time God has blessed you with? In fact, I would encourage us to ask that question to ourselves from time to time. What is it that you're really searching for in this life? Now, if you are someone who does not believe in God, if you are someone who does not believe in eternity, what is it that you have to search for? What you have to search for is temporary pleasure. What you have to search for is financial gain that gives you moments of satisfaction or achievement. But for those of us found in Jesus Christ, let me say this very carefully. Part of the folly of trying to figure out how you're going to use this blessing of time without regard for God's will is that not a single one of us in this room, from the youngest to the eldest, have an idea of what tomorrow is going to bring. How can you know what your future is going to be when you can't even tell me that you have tomorrow guaranteed. It would seem foolish, I would guess by that mind, it would seem foolish to plan the use of your time without first consulting the only one who knows what tomorrow will bring. You see, you serve a God who knows what is in store for you tomorrow. Did you know that? He knows every second of every hour, of every day, of every week, of every month, of every year that has been set for your life here on this earth. He knows that. So why not sit down and consult with Him about your future? In fact, I want you to look at Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 10. Now, Paul writes something that should convict us in our hearts about us and our use with God and the usage of our time. Paul says, "For we are His workmanship." You did not create yourself. You didn't design your life. You are designed. You were God's workmanship, created through and in Christ Jesus. Now, what is the purpose for your life? Why did Jesus go through the pain and the suffering, the agony of the cross to win the victory? Why did He go through all of that? So that we could be in the midst of good works in our life. Paul says, which God prepared ahead of time for us to do. If you don't understand it, let me put it to you this way. Let's say you do something good for someone else today. Maybe you're driving home this morning and you see someone who is in need. Do you realize that if you stop and you help that person, that it was God ahead of time who prepared you to be able to accomplish that work? In every case of every matter throughout biblical understanding, when it comes to good works, the fact is, if God is involved, and He always is, God should get the credit. Let me ask you guys in this room a question, and you ladies. How many of you have ever started a project, one that you put a lot of time and effort into, only to find out when you're done, you did it wrong? A lot of wives looking at their husbands. Man, you feel bad when that happens, don't you? A lot of the time, you feel bad because you did it wrong. You feel bad because you wasted a lot of time doing it wrong, and that now you're out of time or you have to do a poor job of it just to get it done, and that is frustrating. Folks, we only have one life to live. Here on this earth, appointed for man once to live. So let me ask you, do you want to waste it by chasing stuff, by pursuing stuff in your life that is not important? And oh, what a mess we make out of life sometimes, don't we? When we pursue all these things that really and truly matter nothing in the end run of life. Now look at verse 15. James says, instead you should say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. Quite simply, the point is this: there's got to be a better way to use our time. There are a lot of time wasters in our life right now. There are a lot of things that we can waste seconds, minutes, hours of our day, and we become so wrapped up in these things we don't realize until time has passed by significantly how much time we've thereby wasted on these things. Now, as we get into the newer generation of technology, one of the things that caught my attention recently was a study talking about something in our culture we call binge watching. How many of you know what binge watching is? That's where now on programs like Netflix and Hulu and Amazon Prime, they put out new shows, but instead of having to wait and watch it once a week, you can just sit down and for hours and hours and hours start that program and watch it till its conclusion. Sometimes as many as 12 to 14 episodes an hour long. And there have been in this study showings that there have been people who have made themselves physically ill by sitting down and binge watching. They forget to eat. They forget to drink. They get so wrapped up and they lose track of what? Time. Some of you, myself included, have binge watched a few programs in your life, right? It's too bad that back in the 80s, they didn't have Dallas on Netflix. Because if they did, my grandmother would have had me binge watching some Dallas. You wouldn't have had to wait so long to figure out who shot JR, would you, Barry? But there are a lot of things, and you know I'm telling you the truth, there are a lot of things that are time wasters in our life. So let me ask you this question. When you look at the lives of New Testament individuals who were leaders in the church, do you see individuals that occupied their time with a lot of time-wasting elements? In fact, throughout Paul's letters, Paul would always have a plan. But there was one aspect of his life that has stood out to me for years and years. No matter what he had planned, he always asked if God was willing it to be. He would always say that if God wills it. In other words, his plans were always in subjection to God's plans. So I ask you this morning, we read this from James. James is offering you a better way to plan how to use the blessing of time that you have, as opposed to the scenario we read in verse 13. The attitude of someone who is driven by faith, someone who has given their life to Jesus, will take God's wishes and God's plans and put them in the preeminent role in their life versus their own wishes and their own plans. In fact, let me tell you this morning, there are two great blessings in life. And I pray that no matter the fact, we know that one of these blessings we have right now, we have it right here and right now. The other one, some of us have yet to taste of, but you still have access to it. The two greatest blessings that anyone will ever receive, number one is time, and most importantly, the time extension, which is salvation. Without salvation, you are limited to a mortal life filled with mortal pursuits. With salvation, you have the opportunity for spiritual pursuits, for a life that will carry on in joy and in happiness and glory for God for an eternity. So when I ask you this morning to consider one thing about your life, and I know that you're hungry, and I know that you've got all these distractions in life, but we talk about and we make a big deal about Christ being your Lord, right? Is Christ your Lord this morning? I'm asking you again, is Christ your Lord this morning?
Yes.
Well, let me ask you to think about it. Is Christ's lordship in your life represented by your pursuits? It better be. And there are times where I have to repent because I've allowed myself to pursue things that did not indicate that lordship over my life. Have you ever had that? If there's anyone this morning who can walk out of those doors and say, Jonathan, I've lived my life and my entire life has been absolutely centered on the lordship of Jesus Christ, I will come to you and I will bow down and kiss your feet. But I know I'm not going to be kissing many feet this morning because every one of us have the same issue. We all get distracted. Here's the truth. We talk about people having our best interest. You've heard that phrase? God always has your best interest in mind. God always has our best in mind. So we can trust if we seek His will. Seek ye first the kingdom of, and all these things shall be added to you. If you put God first, He will most definitely see to it that you are blessed. And it will be a blessing for us. But finally this morning, the lesson is yours. One day, you'll stand before God. Are you ready this morning to stand before Him and tell Him, God, this is why I used my time the way I did? Every one of us will give an account to God for the way we've used the time that we have in our life. There are going to be some mighty nervous people standing before God giving an account for the way they misused their time. There's no reason for anybody in this room to have to feel that way on Judgment Day. I want you to stand before God and be glad that for the first time you've seen God. You ain't got anything to worry about because right there beside Him at His right hand is whom? Jesus. And He testifies for you and says, that's one of mine. He used His time to follow after me. Will you take up that cross and follow after Jesus? Will you operate on God's timeline? Or will you simply substitute it for your own? That's the question that we all have to answer. This morning, if you need to respond to the Lord's invitation, maybe you need the prayers of your brothers and sisters here this morning. Maybe it's time, it's just a matter of time until you give your life to Jesus Christ through baptism. This is the only time that you own. Use it if you're not a Christian to begin your walk with Jesus. Whatever way we can help you, let us help you as we stand now and sing together.